What is your favorite random historical fact? King Richard's troops catapulted live beehives as bombs during the Third Crusade. Richard the Lionheart was truly fascinating. He pretty much steamrolled his way to Jerusalem before realizing, wait a second. Okay. So if I lay siege to the city, I'd be pinned down if enemy reinforcements arrive. And even if I take the city, well I'm the King of England. I can't just stay in Jerusalem for the rest of my life. And I can't leave my entire army behind to hold the city either. And if I leave a small force to hold the city, they'll be left hugely outnumbered and get massacred once the rest of us are gone. Okay, yeah. Let's call it a draw. Not to mention the fact that he got killed trying to suppress a small peasant uprising that had taken up residence in a small keep. And by a random schmuck with a crossbow no less. All because he decided to ride around with no armor on and yell at the archers up on top of the walls. The first man to fly an airplane and the first man to step foot on the moon lived at the same time. Orville Wright died in 1948. And Neil was born in 1930. I think the bigger thing when looking at these dates is Orville Wright witnessing the advancement of war with aircraft. Bombing, conventional and nuclear. Air raids. Parachute drops. The Children of God cult was so controlling that they had rules for how many squares of toilet paper members could use. Otherwise, Mike the Chicken was a headless chicken that survived for about a year and a half after his accident. Jim Jones, of the Jonestown Massacre, was once a door-to-door monkey salesman. I love that door-to-door monkey sales were a thing. The average American WW2 soldier saw 10 days of combat a year. In Vietnam, it was 240 days. There once existed an alleged theoretical state of war that lasted 335 years and 19 days. And was between the Dutch and an archipelago off the coast of southwest England called the Isles of Scilly. What's more, there were no casualties because the Dutch forgot that they were at war with the Isles. It wasn't until a Scilly historian contacted the Dutch about the war in 1985 and received the information that the war was still technically ongoing, that a peace treaty was signed in 1986. Smallpox could have been completely eradicated. But 2 samples were kept. One for the US CDC and one in Russia. Then Russia made 2,000 tons of smallpox bioweapon that disappeared after the Cold War. They kept the samples in case we ever needed to make more vaccine. Because there's always the chance that there's some tiny pocket of it out there that was overlooked through which it could come back. There once was a Lakota warrior whose name meant something like, fights so hard he doesn't even take time to care for his own needs. His name in English due to translation errors was Stinky Horse Blanket. Not sure if this has already been shared. But here's one of my favorites. In WW2, in an attempt to fool the Allied powers, Germany built a small airbase and filled it with wooden mock-ups that were made to look like aircraft so they could make it seem that they had more aircraft than they really had. The British then rolled up and dropped a single wooden bomb on it soon after. King Tut wasn't some great king. He was severely physically deformed. And didn't reign that long. Ironically, he was so mediocre that his tomb was left alone by raiders. For this reason, his tomb was discovered later by historians untouched, making him the most famous pharaoh of all time. An actual bear served as a Polish corporal during World War II. His name was Wojciech and was adopted by the army after his mother was killed by hunters. That bear was my grandfather. And I couldn't be more proud. Pythagoras was afraid of beans. One of the most famous and important mathematicians and logicians in history. Kurt Gödel developed a crippling obsessive fear of being poisoned. He would only eat food that his wife prepared. When she ended up being hospitalized for 6 months, he literally starved himself to death. In 547 BC, Pythagoras almost died after eating diseased beans for dinner. He never ate beans again. Pythagoras was continually teased by his geometry gang for the rest of his life for his widely reported fear of beans. In 1814, when the British marched into Washington, D.C., they didn't burn everything down right away. First they sat a day down to eat the freshly prepared presidential meal at the White House, and then they made a bunch of presidential proclamations like better training for American troops and freedom for all the slaves. I've told this story before, but it never fails to amuse me. Strap in. Boys and girls, it's time to learn about that time in pre-revolutionary France where bleeding from your A was a fashion statement. In early 1685, King Louis XIV of France developed a fistula, a small channel near his hole, resulting in great pain. Fistulas, much like the Wu-Tang Clan, ain't nothin' to F with. Eventually the pain got so bad that he couldn't ride a horse, sit for long periods, which is kind of important when you're a king, or even make a bowel movement without regretting it immensely. The normal remedies were applied, enemas and poultices from morning until night. With zero effect, Louis decided, you know what? F it. Let's go down the surgical route. Unfortunately for Louis, at the time there was no surgical route. He hired a surgeon barber named Charles François Felix and asked him to fix him. Not entirely stupid and not willing to risk effing up a novel surgery on the King of France, Felix requested 6 months to practice, which he did on prisoners. Live prisoners. Live. Healthy prisoners, sometimes as many as 4 a week. In an era where antiseptics and anesthetics didn't exist, the success rates were about as you'd imagine, although at least some of the 75-ish prisoners he tried this on survived, and eventually Felix felt confident enough to perform the surgery on the king. And it worked. Within 3 months, the king was riding his horse like nothing had happened, and Felix was the talk of the town. People were desperate to emulate the king so badly that people who were entirely healthy would pay Felix to perform the surgery on them. And those less willing to suffer, or at least less willing to pay, would fake having the surgery, wearing bandages known as La Royale to mimic the king and pretend that they too were cool and with it, even though with it meant suffering from a painful condition. I feel smarter now. Charles Darwin ate every animal that he studied. I'm suddenly uncomfortable that he wrote a book called The Descent of Man. 1 in 5 Mexicans died in the Mexican Revolution that lasted from 1910 to 1920. In China, the Three Kingdoms War, 200 AD, 40 million out of China's 60 million were killed. In terms of both absolute numbers and percentage of population that died, it is one of the most bloodiest in world history. The Mongols waited until the winter to start their invasion of Russia. This doesn't surprise me. Mongolia is very, very cold. Its capital city, Ulaanbaatar, is the coldest capital city in the world. The average high temperature in January is 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit, with an average low of -14.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Compared to that, Moscow's balmy. The Romans celebrated a festival known as the Lupercalia. This involved priests sacrificing a goat, briefly anointing themselves with its blood, cutting off strips of its flesh for use as whips, and running naked around the Palatine Hill, whipping anyone they encountered, laughing as they did so. Typically women would attempt to get themselves whipped, as this supposedly ensured fertility and a safe childbirth. Wearing kilts was illegal in Scotland after the failed Jacobite uprising of 1745-6. However, there were very few British troops in the remote Highlands and Islands, so the more bold Scotsmen would wear kilts when they were near home. On the island of Sale, then, there was an inn called Tea and Truish, or House of Trousers, where those men would change from a kilt to pants when they were going to the more tightly controlled mainland, and vice versa. During the siege of Tenochtitlan, Cortez's conquistadors built a trebuchet that fired one shot. It fired straight up, and the projectile destroyed the trebuchet on its way back down. The superior siege weapon. Abraham Lincoln visited a friend often at his farm. They were sharpening knives for some reason. Lincoln used it last, and the man couldn't find the whetstone for several years until Lincoln returned. When asked where Lincoln had left it, he walked over to the post they were next to when using it, and picked it up off the top of it, where the man couldn't see just a foot out of sight. Oh my God. In 1956, a man named Tommy Fitzpatrick stole a small plane from New Jersey for a bet and then landed it perfectly on the narrow street in front of the bar he had been drinking at in Manhattan. 2 years later, he did it again after someone didn't believe he had done it the first time. The story of Nicholas Alcemade should be made into a movie. On the night of the 24th of March 1944, 21-year-old Alcemade was one of 7 crew members in Avro Lancaster BMK 2 DS-664 of No. 115 Squadron RAF, returning from a 300-bomber raid on Berlin, east of Schmallenberg. DS-664 was attacked by a German Ju-88 night fighter, caught fire and began to spiral out of control, because his parachute had gone up in flames and thus was unserviceable. Alcemade jumped from the aircraft without it, preferring to die by impact rather than burn to death. He fell 18,000 feet (5,500 meters) to the ground below. His fall was broken by pine trees and a soft snow cover on the ground. He was able to move his arms and legs and suffered only a sprained leg. The Lancaster crashed in flames, killing pilot Jack Newman and 3 other members of the crew. They are buried in the CWGC's Hanover War Cemetery. Alcemade was subsequently captured and interviewed by the Gestapo, who were initially suspicious of his claim to have fallen without a parachute until the wreckage of the aircraft was examined. Reportedly, the Germans gave Alcemade a certificate testifying to the fact he was a celebrated prisoner of war, before being repatriated in May 1945. When flaming alcohol flooded the streets of Dublin, Ireland, and the only deaths were because of alcohol poisoning from drinking it directly off the road. During the Finnish Civil War, you could get executed for mispronouncing one in Finnish. That the Danes only held with Napoleon because Great Britain attacked them for not choosing side. Lawrence of Arabia accidentally shot his own camel in a sandstorm.